Because I think this ruling will spur that kind of reform, or at least an effort at that kind of reform in more states. Because as Jeff said, it is an absolute green light to states to be as aggressive as they want to be in redistricting, and that is something that the Republican Party employed to the max after the 2010 landslide that they had and the redistricting that followed.
Elizabeth, we heard a foreshadowing of a decision like this from Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg just a few weeks ago, who compared what she called the huge importance of the census decision, which we'll get in just a few moments, to the fight over the travel ban, and talked about the concern over divisions like this, 5-4 division, saying, given the number of most watched cases still unannounced, I cannot predict that the relatively low sharp divisions ratio will hold. And that's exactly what happened here.
Right. And, you know, it seems like a division ideologically, but it also, I think, is a division in who has their head in the sand and who doesn't. You know, like we saw last year with the Muslim ban case. The conservative majority went forward as if this was any other presidential administration, that President Trump did not have his tweets saying that the Muslim ban was intended to attack Muslims. And here I think we have, first with this partisan gerrymandering decision, Chief Justice Roberts trying to make it seem like he's not doing politics, but in reality, he's absolutely doing politics, because as we've just heard from both Ron and Jeffrey, this will only make polarization worse. And frankly, as a constitutional lawyer, I'm deeply disappointed that the court did not do its job in our constitutional system and apply the Constitution and the law. You have these plaintiffs coming to the court saying, our First Amendment rights are being violated, our equal protection rights are being violated because we're being marginalized based on our political affiliation and being packed into these districts. And the court basically denied their ability to come into the Supreme Court and have the Constitution enforced. And that's the Supreme Court's job. And I don't think they did it in this case.
And Jeffrey, I think you brought up a really salient and important point at the top there, and it's a decision made previously on racial gerrymandering and what's allowed there versus political. So explain why the court decided one way in racial gerrymandering and this way on political.
Well, the Constitution, says there can be no racial discrimination.
Right.
I mean, but as Chief Justice Roberts points out, the Constitution says nothing about political discrimination. Now, the fact is, in the real world, since African Americans are overwhelmingly Democratic, the line between racial discrimination and political discrimination is almost impossible to draw. And Democrats have been pointing out for years that, in fact, political discrimination often is racial discrimination. But Chief Justice Roberts was not interested in that argument. He said when Democrats, draw lines to benefit Democrats and Republicans draw district lines to benefit Republicans, that's not the court's business. The Constitution has nothing to say about that. That is simply a political question, not a legal question, and we're going to stay out of it. But the bright line that Chief Justice Roberts draws in this opinion between racial discrimination, which is illegal, and political discrimination, which is legal now, that line may not exist in the real world.
Well,
go ahead,
Poppy.
Yes.
I would say last year in the Texas case, as Jeffrey knows, they narrowed the use of racial discrimination to challenge district lines. And the Abbott versus Perez, I think, was the name of the case. And of course, Shelby County, the landmark, probably one of the 2 or 3 most significant decisions of the Roberts Court, eliminated the pre-clearance provisions of the Voting Rights Act, which were designed to prevent racial discrimination. So it's not as if they are a bulwark against racial discrimination in electoral processes and are only kind of allowing partisan manipulation to go forward. On both fronts, they are rolling back the ability to constrain this kind of behavior, and it is a pretty consistent pattern. I quoted someone in my story this week noting that on these cases you begin to get the evidence begins to accumulate that what the 5 Republican justices on the court are doing is building a perpetual motion machine. Releasing a series of rulings over a period of years that benefit the Republican electoral prospects and thus make it more likely that it will be Republicans picking the justices.
So to that question of, what is just and unjust, Chief Justice Roberts just addressed that in his majority opinion. Let me read you part of it as I go to my colleague Jessica Schneider. Jess, this stands out. Quote, excessive partisanship in districting leads to results that reasonably seem unjust, but the fact that such gerrymandering is incompatible with democratic principles, Arizona state legislature, does not mean that the solution lies with the federal judiciary, saying it might seem unjust, but we can't solve this.
Well, and that's exactly the holding in this opinion today. And he continues on to say, Poppy, and this is important in the opinion, saying our conclusion does not condone excessive partisan gerrymandering, nor does our conclusion condemn complaints about districting to echo and to avoid. And then he goes on to talk about how the states are addressing this issue, how a number of commissions have been set up in the states to address this issue of redistricting and claims of extreme partisan gerrymandering. So the court saying here, we have to stay out of this. This isn't our lane. This is a political question. This should be handled by Congress, also by state legislatures who are in charge of drawing these lines. But, you know, Poppy, I mean, this is a sharply divided court right now, and this really is the first major case that we've seen this break. 5-4, this solidly conservative majority, and we're really feeling the effects of Justice Anthony Kennedy's retirement just 1 year ago. Justice Kagan is on the bench right now reading her dissent forcefully. This is something justices really only do. We've seen it more and more lately, but justices really only do when they have a very forceful dissent and when they're very passionate about their dissent. I'll read you briefly what Justice Kagan is reading up on the bench right now. She says, of all times to abandon the court's duty to declare the law, this was not the one. The practices challenged in these cases imperil our system of government, and part of the court's role in that system is to defend its foundation. So the 4 liberal justices here, Justice Kagan reading from the bench right now, slamming this decision by Chief Justice Roberts and the 4 other conservative justices to stay out of this. But Justice Roberts, in his opinion, defending that decision, saying that this is not the role of the courts to decide this, and instead let this play out in the states that have already established commissions, in the state legislatures, and perhaps even in Congress. Poppy?
Jessica Schneider, great reporting. Thank you.